Serious, Redditors who work at cemeteries and graveyards, what strange and scary stuff have you witnessed? In the cemetery mausoleum chapel where I occasionally play the organ for funerals, vandals had broken in the night before a service. They smashed several crypt covers, probably with sledgehammers, exposing the remains of those that had been entombed therein. It was an eerie atmosphere to hold a funeral service that morning with such desecration in plain sight. Oh shit, I was gonna ask if grave robbing is still a thing. It isn't. We, the Czech Republic, had cases where people broke into old German graves to pull golden teeth and steal golden rings off skeletons 100 years old. They counted on the fact that the Sudeten German community no longer exists, being removed to Germany after the World War II, so no one is going to notice abandoned graves being dug up. Spoiler alert, people still noticed. My dad purchased a cemetery when I was in middle school, and I worked for him through high school graduation. I did yard work, mowing, weed eating, flower beds, etc. Aside from the occasional shadows seen out of the corner of my eye, seeing people who turned out to not be there, and hearing strange sounds, the cemetery was actually a quite peaceful place. But the strangest is when you have a burial in the crypts. Basically, you dig down about 4 or 5 feet to expose giant cement doors. You pull the cement doors off and drop down into a little room. These rooms can fit 2 coffins, or years and years and years worth of cremated remains. So back in the 50s and 60s, families would buy one crypt and the entire fam would be cremated and put in it. Some just put the cremated remains in it and close her up, but others light candles and leave flowers and souvenirs and pictures and shit. It's fucking creepy opening up one of those bad boys after 50 years and finding melted candles and old pictures of the people inside. Plus when you hop down in there you have a weird realization that you are at the same level and completely surrounded by bodies. We had a late afternoon service once that ran into the evening. It was October, so the sun went down early while I was filling in the grave afterwards. Conveniently none of the lights on the loader tractor worked for some reason. No blown fuses or loose wires or anything, the lights just didn't work. Next day when I reported the issue we went over to the same tractor and the lights worked perfectly fine and they worked fine the rest of the time I worked there. Despite all the rational reasons there likely are to explain this, yeah, that's pretty creepy. Worked in a cemetery over the summer during college. One morning I was mowing the grounds and discovered the body of a cat which had been bound and set on fire. People fucking suck sometimes. My school was by a graveyard and I'd have to pass it to get from the library to my apartment. I would be getting back at 1 or 2 AM. Every time I walk by I would see a light on the grave. I figured someone added a light to their loved one's grave, thought it was weird and joked about it with my roommates when I would get home. After a few months of seeing it, I had friends in town and we were exploring the area, so we decided to go into the cemetery. We couldn't find the grave with the light on it. We searched for a while before they shrugged it off. The next day I walked by and there the small green light was beaming again. I didn't want to jump the fence alone just to investigate. So I dragged my roommate out and once more we couldn't find the light. Even when we walked by it they couldn't see the light. No matter what, I saw that light walking by. Grew up across the street from a graveyard. There are a ton of people in there at night. Some are prostitutes turning tricks. Some are drug deals. Some are grieving families saying goodnight to lost loved one. Some are prostitutes turning tricks. What? You mean you don't go to your local graveyard to get laid? I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. Summertime job for a 16-year-old. Nothing crazy. Just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones, etc. Now to just put a setting. The cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of this cemetery, a small simple mausoleum, and then other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forests in the Georgia country. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid, plus I watch a lot of scary movies and so on. I know, bad combo. So one night I was doing my rounds, and I had to go into the small mausoleum, had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within, and I had to go in, Macasure always neat and clean. Standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. So I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty damn cold. During the summer in Georgia, that was odd. There was a light coming from the mausoleum, and as I approached, I heard voices, laughter from a child, a little girl. I thought it was simply younger folks maybe. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. However, as I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instant. I pause. The light I also noticed had gone out. I call the lone security officer that does the few rounds on the lot, cause I'm not gonna go in alone, and he comes. We will call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing was disturbed within, but it was open, and a doll lay on the stone beneath it. Me and Officer Friendly do a small sweep. It was only one floor and one room, so it didn't take long. We close the door to the girl's entombment, and we both leave. As we walk away, we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, and then all of a sudden, boom, voices and laughter again. I jump, and Officer Friendly looks to me, looking pretty shaken, says to me, "You hear it too?" We look back, and boom, lights back, laughter continuing. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning, the door was open again. This time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day. I'm good lol. Well, my dad worked at a funeral home and I'm telling his story. One day about a year ago I was super bored and so I asked him about his days working at this funeral home. He tells me this story is not twisted to make it weird, it really happened like this. So some older lady had passed away due to old age symptoms or something. And her twin sister was the only person left at the church place where they did the celebration of life ceremony, and while my dad was walking around cleaning up. TBH, I don't exactly know what my dad did there because he didn't tell me, and when this happened I was like 2. He overheard her talking to herself. He walked behind her trying to listen in without her noticing, and she was saying some shit like, "I shouldn't be here and my time's up." My dad was freaked out by this and asked her if she was okay. She turned around and said no. The next day she was found dead by her caretakers in her room. She had overdosed on her prescription. Neither of them were married and I think my dad said they worked until they were like 70. Not really a cemetery story, but still pretty freaky. Sometimes when one twin dies and they were super close, the other one loses the will to live. Broken heart syndrome. It happened when my dad died and his identical twin died a year or so later. He just kinda gave up because he missed my dad so much. I hope they are together and happy and I get to see them when my time comes. I don't work at a cemetery, but one of my friends does. Let's call him CJ. One day CJ was at the cemetery and he saw a strange man in the distance. He obviously called the police because the guy looked strange and he would just stare at CJ. This was at around 11 PM and the police arrived. When the police arrived they caught the man. As it turns out he was one of the serial killers in Florida, and this happened a couple years ago. It still gives me the chills even though I wasn't a part of it. I work security for a nursery, for trees and plants, and when they changed owners, before my time, the new owners found that the old owners had dug up part of a graveyard. Broken headstones were just piled up next to still standing ones. And so the company puzzled the headstones back together and set them in concrete. All that setup is to tell you that I would be patrolling in a vehicle and I would go past the cemetery and there would be this coyote and a owl just hanging out in the middle of the graveyard looking at me. This happened pretty regularly. TLDR, an owl and coyote would stare at me from a graveyard. My great-great-grandfather and his son were foremen at the cemetery in my hometown, of course way before I was ever around. The older of them was said to be sensitive, as in he felt and saw things, and there are stories of people that he buried that came by during nights to tell him that they were cold, which means that there were no flowers wreaths on the grave, or that their feet were cold. The soil around where the foot of the casket was had leveled. He was also said to be able to see people in what we refer to as Hamford skin journey, as in the body shows itself to tell someone that the soul has departed. One particular story about that they still tell around the Sunday dinner table is when a friend of his had been lost at sea. Nobody knew of course until much later, but my 2xg grandfather saw his friend entering the house, drenched in seawater, and noisily walk into the living room and sits himself on an old sailor's chest that was by the door, and just as soon the man disappears. My great grandfather took over his father's job when he got too old to do it. I can't remember any similar stories about him, but there is a joke about some youngsters that tried to scare him that people have told all over the country, probably an imported joke. There were a few people in town that didn't like the fact that the graveyard workers worked after dark, and there were a group of young men that decided that enough was enough. They were going to scare the gravedigger. So they outfitted themselves with white sheets and went to the graveyard and walked around the graveyard saying all sorts of ghostly sounds like boo, and they found the gravedigger as he was in the middle of digging a grave by hand, and they stood around the grave for what seemed like hours, shouting and screaming and doing whatever it is that ghosts do. The gravedigger paid them no mind and just continued with his work. The young men then, having given up, started to leave, and as they approached the gate of the graveyard they could hear shouting and protesting behind them. As the gravedigger angrily came running towards them, shouting, "It's one thing that you are up and about walking around here, but don't you think for a second that I will allow you to leave?" Friend works at a funeral home and I've been with her during the wee hours when they are prepping bodies. The scary stuff aren't the dead bodies, but the drugged up hobos that come to find shelter. Tweaked TF out, making inaudible grunts and shrieks, walking, if that, more twitching,